Max Dupree, the eminent Christian businessman in the US, after whose name the centre in which I worked was entitled, the Max Dupree Centre for Leadership, used to say that the first quality of a leader is to ask good questions. Not to give good answers, because good answers only come from asking good questions first. And the very first question he would ask, not just a person, but an organisation he was addressing, was not what we would tend to ask, what do you want to do? Tell me that, and then maybe I can help you achieve that more effectively. No, the first question he said that we should be asking such people, or that we should be asking ourselves, either as individuals or an organisation, is, who do I or we want to become? Until you have worked out who I want to become, either individually or corporately, I cannot fully and properly, effectively answer the question, what should I or we actually do? Other questions follow in its wake of that first question. Here's a second of a first trio of questions he would encourage people to ask in leadership positions, particularly those moving into public square responsibilities. What does your behaviour say about your personal set of values? Not what is your personal set of values, or what do you think about values, but what does your behaviour say are actually your values? What does your workspace and work environment that you create say about what you value? Because that will give it away instantly, no matter what you think it does, or think it should. Then he would ask a second trio of questions. What uncomfortable questions are you asking of yourself and your organisation or your movement? Questions which are making them uneasy. What other questions should you be asking than the ones that you actually are? What questions others ask you are you evading or not answering properly? Watched an interview just this afternoon, Linda and I, of the CEO of our biggest bank, the Commonwealth Bank in Australia, which is involved in some very doubtful and scandalous and possibly criminal activity. And for 30 minutes, he refused to answer the actual questions which people were asking of him. He just dodged around them for 30 minutes. Another set of questions which he could ask would be this. Are you treating every person who works with you equally? Every person. How are you a gift to the spirit of others who work with you and around you, to encourage their potential? What are you not measuring in your organisation? Don't tell me what you are measuring. I know what you are measuring, and it's probably got numbers. I want to know what you are not measuring, because it's the things that don't have numbers which ultimately are the most important and, strangely enough, will produce the best numbers. And then finally he would ask, what are you doing to help people learn in your organisation? To learn something new, learn something more, learn a second skill. Everybody who worked for Max Dupree in his furniture factory was taught to learn a second job so that they had two jobs that they could do, not just in the organisation, but two jobs they could apply for if they ever had to leave it. He doubled their value as workers at his expense. And then he would ask leaders, as he asked himself increasingly, are you doing yourself out of a job? Because unless you are doing yourself out of a job, you are not doing what a leader should. Because a leader should be raising people who can do the job, not just as well as you, but probably better than you. A lot of this reminds me of one of the most significant sayings of the great French lay thinker Jacques Ellul, who was a great doer as well as a great thinker. And he said that a fundamental responsibility of the thoughtful Christian is to ask the questions which nobody else is asking. Well, we need leaders who ask those sorts of questions in the public square, and then we will get the kind of public quality and advance that we really desire. Questions are important. Important also, however, are ways of saying things to people, of crystallizing reality and explaining it to others that go beyond simple, clear statements about what is taking place. It's important to have some simple, clear statements at times. They're very necessary, but they're not necessarily all that is required. And the person who has tackled this best is the author and leadership thinker and practitioner Richard Farson in a book called Management of the Absurd. Came out some years ago. He says that the most important things we need to know about how workplaces, both in the marketplace or in the wider public sphere, operate can only be captured in paradoxical statements. Not just clear, direct, simple statements, they've got a place, but statements which actually look contradictory, but aren't. And it's only by putting a certain contradiction or what appears to be one out there that you can actually begin to get to the deep meaning and essence of what really should be taking place. One that we often refer to ourselves is the statement, nothing is as invisible as the obvious. Most of us know that. It's the things that you should be able to see, which are often the ones that you just don't and miss them altogether. It's a great gift to be able to see the obvious and make it visible when we should all know that it's actually there. But he goes on to list a number of other paradoxes. Here are a few of them. The more important a relationship with someone you're working with, the less skill matters. Next one. Technology frequently creates the opposite of its intended purpose. So be careful. Again, the most effective managers are not in control. The more we try to communicate, the less we mostly communicate. If you've got to keep saying a lot of things, then you're not really saying very much. You're probably saying less and less all the time. You should be able to do it fairly simply and straightforwardly. Listening is far more difficult and important than talking. Because only if you really listen do you know what to say. The best solution for a problem is in the hands of the person who presents it. Big changes are easier to make than small ones. Every great strength is almost always a great weakness. Here's one I like. Lost causes are the only real ones worth fighting for. And if I can throw in an extra one from Max Dupree, which relates to one that Farson has mentioned, the more you get to the top, the less of an expert you become. Because the more there is to know, the more there is to do, the less you are able to fully understand the whole situation, the less you are able to actually do all that is required. And so when people said to Max Dupree, well, what's the solution then to that? What's the answer? He said, well, you surround yourself with the best people that you possibly can. And the one thing you become more effective at is knowing who those people are. You become the amateur, but you learn from the experts whom you have recruited. And that's your particular skill, your ability, your contribution. I just point out that imagination operating in this way of first being able to stand back and ask important questions, or being able to frame ways ahead in paradoxical statements, is found beautifully in the Apostle Paul. Go through his writings at some time and just count up the number of questions he asks. There are over 100 in his letters. Go through and look at the paradoxes that he states. He talks about seeing unseen things, conquering by yielding, finding rest under a yoke, being free but a slave, reigning by serving, being made great by becoming small, being exalted by being humble, becoming wise by being a fool, triumphing through defeat and living by dying. That's just for a start. Wisdom is crucial for those who are leaders and those particularly who are in the complex world of the public square. Imagination, yes. Technical skill in the middle, yes. But practical wisdom on the other side. And it's the three, this trinity you might say, which creates what is most effective. And such wisdom is crucial because what Max Dupree says about rising to the top of one organisation, making you more of an amateur, needing the assistance of others, is even more true in the public square, where you have to work with a wider range of people often to achieve certain objects. Most of the bigger issues in our society are not achieved simply by a definition, a process to get there, and then testing whether the outcome is actually working. They are highly complex issues with all sorts of factors involved in them. It's only if a whole range of stakeholders get together to help resolve the issue that anything is likely to happen. Drugs, it's a problem. Pass laws to get the police have more power and crack down on it. That's not going to solve the problem. It might be 1/5 or 1/4 of the problem, but you need all sorts of other people coming into play on the medical side, on the educational side, on the street, actually working at the street level with people, and I could go on, in order to make any headway whatsoever in this very complex, tricky, but crucial area. And that requires skills of relating to other people, discerning who are the ones who are best to be involved in this, how to weld them into a group which can take common action, how to overcome conflicts, how to confront big egos, or how to encourage those who have low esteem in order to do what they need to do, etc., etc., etc. All of that is difficult. All of that requires certain kinds of experience and maturity and flexibility for it to take place. Flexibility is another crucial characteristic, which is what leads Ronald Heifetz in his book Leadership Without Easy Answers to draw a distinction between what he calls technical leadership and adaptive leadership. Technical leadership will work in a few highly technical areas, but it won't work in the big, wide world outside, particularly in the public square, where problems are complex. New forms of problems constantly keep appearing. There are all sorts of organisations and others to work with, and their flexibility, leadership on the move, leadership which is our current Prime Minister says is agile, can move quickly, can move forwards or sideways or backwards or double around, can go slowly or more quickly as the case requires. That is the only kind of leadership which is really going to make things happen, make things actually work. In fact, the more a purely technical solution, skills-based solution, is put to resolve a complex social issue, the worse it actually becomes. Not the better, but the actual worse it becomes, because it's not the way to treat the problem. It's like a person in the military taking his military approach to life home into the family and running the family as he would run his platoon or his company or his battalion. It not only doesn't work, it makes it worse, actually, except in a few very tiny minor respects. How can we encourage these kinds of leaders? That's my final point. In ways beyond the usual. By all means, some skill-based training, yes. By all means, some 360-degree feedback programs, yes. By all means, some intensive simulation exercises, yes. By all means, leadership seminars and courses, yes. All of these have a role to play, but they are not actually the most fundamental, and they are not, in the long run, the most effective. It's only part of the answer. We need more informal ways of training, developing leaders. We need more lateral and creative ways of doing it. And we need more life-related or centred ways of helping it to take place. Here are 3 suggestions. Leadership in the public square requires knowledge of the wider world. Not just of your own family circumstances or workplace circumstances or leisure organisation circumstances. No, knowledge of the wider world. How does that begin? It actually begins with parents and their young children having a meal together and talking about what is happening in the wider society. That's where it actually begins. That's where leaders are. It's around the dinner table talking about the world at large. The world larger than the family, larger than the neighbourhood, larger than the church, the world at large. That's how it actually begins. It inculcates broad interests. It inculcates conversational learning, which is a crucial way of learning, far more fundamental than any courses or seminars or lectures like this. And it inculcates at its best reading habits spinning out of that, whether it's a newspaper or it's a book or it's online. Later on, beyond childhood and teenage years, with adults, something more is required. If I can quote Max Dupree again, one of the most controversial things he did in his own company once a month was for several hours to pull out his middle and senior managers and invite them to listen to somebody speak for 30 minutes and then spend 2 or 3 hours discussing with them. When this first happened, all his people thought he would be pulling in some other business leader like himself. But he had one rule in inviting people into this group, and that was none of them should have anything to do with business. So who did he invite? He invited economists, people who worked in technological fields, He invited sociologists, philosophers, psychologists, authors, even a theologian or two. The obvious objection was raised by some of his people after one or two of these had spoken. What do these people know about the hard-headed world of business? What can they possibly say that might be of any use to us and this firm? To which he replied, out of his deeply Christian, in fact, reformed Christian convictions, all truth is connected. Truth in any one area of life is connected to truth in every other area of life. I only bring people in who I feel have plumbed the depths of some deep truth in their own particular sphere. It's not their job to make the connection with business, it's your job. That's your job. That's partly why I hired you. And if you can't make that connection, perhaps I should let you go and you should not be here. Secondly, if the kind of leadership we need in the public square is not framed by title or by position or by class or by education, then it is what Ronald Heifetz calls leadership without obvious authority. It's because you have the goods, not because you come from the goods or you're titled as having the goods or you have a position which suggests you have the goods. How does that kind of leadership get encouraged and developed? Some years ago at Fuller Seminary, the well-known American evangelist Leighton Ford came on a visit, and we pulled together a group of the students who we felt had particular potential to become influential people, not just in the church or the parachurch, but in the wider lay world. Some of them were just there studying because they wanted to go back into their careers as more informed Christians. He talked about the fact that the leaders of the future, even in the church, would be people who relied less on title or position, but who exercised what he called informal authority rather than formal authority. And he said, how do we help train these people? He said, what I would do is encourage all of you here to join a voluntary organisation of one kind or another, quite outside the church, not one that's particularly Christian, not even one perhaps that's got some humanitarian or social cause, so that's fine. It could be just a club, an interest group or a hobby group or something like that. Just join it. Join it as everybody else joins it because you have an interest in what they're doing. Don't talk about your educational achievements. Don't talk about what family you've come from, if it happens to be an important one. Just become part of the group, join in the group, exercise your passion, and see whether you become the kind of person who can help guide this group to do what it wants to do best. Whether other people are drawn towards you, are attracted to what you have to say or the kind of person you are, and want to work with you in order to further that particular way of defining what this group is for. See whether you actually are the kind of person who has the informal authority that will enable not just organisations or society in general to get where it needs to go, but increasingly even the church and Christian organisations to go where it should. Good advice. Good advice from a man who knows something about what he is saying. Finally, how, in a more personal way, do we encourage younger, more junior people to find their own contribution to make in the area that we're talking about? Mentoring is one of the ways that is often discussed and at its best practiced. But that's often to do with passing on skills, talking about how to exercise certain abilities. At best maybe the kind of wisdom that you need to gain from somebody who has been there before you and knows a little bit more than you do about it all. But more than that, it's required. There needs to be more of the person who is shared. The hardships that they have faced as a more senior pursuer of a certain form of leadership. The pressures they've been under, the stresses they've experienced, their failures, the things that did not work, the mistakes that they actually made. Because that's at the very heart of what makes a good leader. To find a way through all those sorts of pressures, to learn to become the kind of person who can sustain what needs to be held onto in and through all those difficulties. Paul is another great example of this. I keep introducing him because in many respects he is a model leader. Think of what he said to Timothy, his protege, you might say. You have followed my teaching. Good, yes, we understand that. We think that's at the centre of mentoring. But he says, not just my teaching, also my conduct. You've observed how I actually behave. You have followed my faith, yes. And I've talked about that, and you've picked up on it. But he also adds, and my practice. How I actually put it into action. Whether I live it out in a way that's consistent. You have followed my steadfastness, because I've been at this for some time, but he says, also my sufferings. You've seen how I respond to those. What they do to me. They did all sorts of things which Paul often found deeply hurtful, deeply painful, deeply perplexing, as we find in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Paul didn't always have it all together, and he wasn't afraid to say so. Here we have a different approach to mentoring which goes a whole lot deeper, but is actually a whole lot more helpful. At the start of a new academic year in Fuller, I met an incoming student and I asked him, as I did many others, why are you here? And he replied quite confidently, and as if he'd said it many times before, I am called to be a leader and I have come here to learn how to become one. Every instinct in my body revolted against that statement. I am called to be a leader at the ripe old age of about 23, and I've come here to learn how to be one. C.S. Lewis was fond of saying, I mentioned this in my lecture last year, that one of the main troubles we human beings have vis-a-vis God is to think of ourselves as nouns when in fact we are only adjectives, qualified by him and all that he is and has revealed and does through us. We do the same with leadership. We turn it into a noun when it's a kind of adjective. It's not something that you are called to be. It's not something out there which you can become. It's not that kind of object. It's actually a quality of other things. It's something you become as a result of other things taking place first. It's what emerges in a secondary way. It's not the primary thing which emerges and then other things get attached to it. No, it's less a thing in itself than a function of the kind of person we are, the kind of contribution we make, and the manner in which we carry it out. It's got less to do with particular skills or techniques or decisions than from behaving and choosing and performing in ways that spring from very deep fundamental attitudes and motives and dispositions. That's why I often say what we need and what the world needs is not even more servant leaders, that's better than having non-servant leaders. No, we need more than servant leaders. What we need is more leading servants of God, of others, and of those necessary things which need to be done in our world. These are the kind of people who we need in the public square and who will make the kind of difference that we actually desire. Thank you.